And of course, it's just a few minutes to go before the top of the hour. Let's quickly turn our attention now to law firm ENSafrica saying that South African employers should anticipate opposition from those in their workforce who are resisting to take vaccines for various reasons. And obviously, this comes at the back of that announcement by President Ramaphosa's announcement that indeed taking a vaccine will not be mandatory, but that it's a voluntary exercise. But are employers vying to make sure that their employees take the vaccine? Well, to give us the latest there, we're joined by the executive at ENSafrica Employment Department, Joe Mothibi. Joe, thanks a lot for joining us this morning on Power Breakfast. A very good morning to you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Now, we're looking at the current status quo when it comes to a lot of corporates as well as employers. Would you say that indeed their mindset is looking at how they can get the employees to take the vaccine and make it mandatory in the workplace?
Well, I'm not sure that it's as clear cut as that. I think what you probably have is a situation where employers, recognizing their obligation to ensure a safe working environment, would look at vaccines as one of the measures that they can implement in the workplace to make sure the workplace is safe. So remember that an employer has that obligation, which is founded in various legislation of Parliament. So vaccines are but one of a range of tools available. I mean, let's not forget, there's still washing of hands, wearing of face masks, and the like. So yes, vaccines are an important consideration, but it is by no means a silver bullet. This debate on vaccines is a global one, actually. The Canadians and everybody are grappling with whether an employer can obligate employees to take a vaccine in the workplace. The answer is by no means clear-cut.
Okay, so if it's no means clear-cut and there's still a gray area, in terms of the employment policies, right? So we sign these contracts and sometimes those small terms and conditions don't get read. Currently, with the South African, when it comes to employment contracts and where we're looking at, does it make certain ways in which we can actually enforce this, where employers can enforce this?
I think it will have to be case specific. A starting point is this: we have a constitution which, among other rights that people have, you and I have, is the right to bodily integrity. So with that in mind, for instance, you have the National Health Act, which stipulates that the health service, which would include the administration of a vaccine, may not be given to people without their consent. So to put in place a contract which compels someone to take a vaccine, it seems to me would go against their right to bodily integrity, which means that, my right to my body is sacrosanct in that sense. Obviously, one has to balance that right against the greater public good. But ultimately, it will have to be case specific. So an employer can't come in my view, and this will ultimately have to be decided by the courts. But in my view, you can't just put in a blanket requirement that everybody must take a vaccine. Some people may refuse to do so on the basis of cultural or other beliefs. Or in fact, it could well be that they have a compromised immune system, be it cancer, HIV, and so forth. So one has to be very careful with this thing. You can't just come in and say, I want everybody to take a vaccine and I'm included in my contract. So last point is this, that remember also contracts of employment are two-way agreement. So where I already have a contract with you and I want to include what seems to me to be a very intrusive term, I would have to get your consent as an employee, and you may well refuse to give that consent to the amendment of the contract.
Joe Mothibi is talking to us, executive in ENSafrica's Employment Department. Joe, it's Iman speaking now. I'm just interested as to why we're raising this question now when, is it being raised by ENS and these possible scenarios based on word that you're hearing from industry and employers that there is the possibility of creating this kind of addendum to working contracts or indeed including it in future contracts?
No, it's not being raised by us necessarily in that context. It is, as I said, a global consideration. Remember, the primary thing is this, that when an employer is required to ensure that the workplace is safe. That's the first thing. So one of the things the employer may consider is to say, look, I'd like all my employees to be vaccinated, okay? Because that will ensure that I create a safe working environment. So it's in that context. So the question is whether if some people refuse to take the vaccine, whether you as the employer can compel them to do so. And that answer lies in the facts of each particular instance. So, for example, radio hosts like you, one can. I think it would be difficult, in my view, for Power FM to obligate you to take that vaccine and to say to you, if you don't take it, you can't work here. But in a different context, maybe let's say air hostesses or pilots traveling into international jurisdictions like Spain, which has now just said South Africans are not allowed to enter their country. You might say, as SAA or some similar airline, that look, all my employees, or at least the host, the pilots and the like, must take the vaccine because it's an inherent requirement of the job. So that case is different to a Power FM case. So it depends on each case, really.
But at the bottom of all of it is, as you've already outlined, is the constitutional obligations that companies, employers would have in how they go about doing this, whether it can be an imposition or whether it has to be the product of a consultative process, and where the labor law stands in red with the Constitution on these things. So it sounds as if at every step they would certainly have an uphill climb in trying to create this as an imposition, unless, of course, there's some other dramatic change in the science.
I agree with that. I think the better view, in my view, is to try and encourage people to go along this way, because ultimately the vaccine is aimed at achieving herd, or as the president prefers, population immunity. So the more people that are vaccinated, the less likelihood it would appear, from what the scientists say, of it spreading. So that's really what you aiming at doing. Remember also, there are other non-intrusive things you can put in place as an employer. I go back to the wearing of masks, washing of hands, social distancing. So those things are still there. So the vaccine is not the only way in which you can ensure a safe working environment. And to then say that everybody must have it, otherwise they can't work here, seems to be extreme. And the employers, it seems to me, may find themselves on the wrong side of the law, depending on the fact.
Let's talk a little bit about worker rights here, Joe. When we're looking at how many times, even we've heard on Power Breakfast, in the first introduction of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we even heard reports of employers forcing their employees to actually take a COVID-19 test. And then what would find a situation that if they're positive, they'd be somehow they'd be let go when it comes to work. Now, in this instance, if the employer, for example, says, I actually need it, let's say you're an air hostess, I need you to take this vaccine in order for you to work in a safe and working environment, the employee says, no, I can't, I don't want to. We can find our courts very full.
Yes, the lawyers will be happier, no doubt. But look, not to be facetious, but the point is, it's important to remember there's two different things there. There's medical testing, which is regulated by the Employment Equity Act, and that is why currently when you go into any workplace, indeed public spaces, you are asked to check, for instance, your temperature and everything. That's testing, and that's allowed. Treatment is different. Treatment talks about me doing something which is intrusive to your body integrity, and that's different, because the different considerations come into being there. But you're quite right. I think this will be an area of contestation. But I think looking at it, it seems to me that the primary thing is to instead of going the compulsory route, to try as much as possible to go the educated and informed consent route. That seems to me much better.
I think that's a note on which we can end. Joe, thank you very much for talking to us this morning. Joe Mothibi is an executive in ENSafrica's Employment Department, sharing some possible future scenarios that might arise out of the vaccine, and whether or not there could be a push towards mandatory vaccination in the workplace. A fascinating discussion.